have the four major traditions of Tibetan Buddhism, of course. The Nyingma is called the ancient one, indicating its connections with the first spread of Buddhism in Tibet in the late 8th century. Actually, of course, as some reason will show any of us, it wasn't called that at the time because there was nobody else around. In fact, it didn't even have a conscious identity as a tradition or a school. It was just the Vajrayana Dharma that came at that time. But later on, when new kind of transmissions of Dharma came from Tibet in the 11th century, they were new, Sarma in Tibetan, new to Tibet. And therefore the followers of the old style, Tantras, who kept that going, they began to kind of think of themselves as the old ones, the Nyingma. So there's this great kind of, in a way, demarcation in Tibetan Dharma history between the old tradition, Nyingma, and the Sarma traditions from the 11th century onwards. And of the Sarma, of these new traditions that came in, there were many, in fact. Some were no more than one Indian guru or one Tibetan translator been to India with a few Tibetan disciples. And some of those lineages probably just died out. They didn't go anywhere. Or they're absorbed usually into the bigger traditions. So over time, not very long time actually, quite a short time, within a couple of generations, the three major new form traditions were there and active and powerful. And they're Kadam and Sakya and Kagyu. Of course, I need to make a note that the Kadam later ceased to exist. It was absorbed into the schools. But essentially, it's one of the three new Tantra traditions of that time. So Kadam, Sakya, and Kagyu. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the founder of that Kagyu tradition. But even there, I've got to be careful because Marpa will die before there are any Kagyu monasteries. Marpa will pass away. Marpa will pass away before, in a way, there's any kind of self-conscious identity of being a Kagyu. I think the name is known. It indicates a certain bunch of transmissions, but it's not a kind of organized institution that can be marked off from the other streams of Vajrayana that are existing at the time. There's Marpa, a very influential, powerful, highly respected figure, and his disciples. Maybe somewhere else there's Drokmi Lotsawa and his, and so on and so forth. And often it's regional; it's confined to a particular valley or group of valleys. So all that I need to say, because otherwise one might get a misunderstanding. Nevertheless, it's valid to say Marpa is the founding father in Tibet of the Kagyu tradition, because what we now know as Kagyu teachings and practices, most of them came through him to his close disciples. So let me explain about his life, because his life both interesting in the sense of he's the source of our Kagyu tradition, but interesting again, it's another way to practice the Dharma. His life, as Dharma always is embodied in human beings, in their personal life circumstances. So the Dharma of everybody has something, a unique flavor. And when you get to the great masters, that's the same. There's no uniformity. And that's wonderful, because then we can see ourselves in different masters in a way. We can see, not that we have the same power or anything like that or realization right now, but we can see in their life circumstances something that might inspire us and make a connection with our life circumstances. So Marpa is born in 1012 in southern central Tibet, and he comes from, I guess, a kind of fairly wealthy family. Wealthy enough to send him away to study Sanskrit when he was about 16. I need to make a little footnote, but it's interesting and helpful, I think. Much of what is talked about Marpa is, nowadays, and particularly in the West, has its origin in a 15th, 16th century history of Marpa written in Tibet. At that time, there's a bunch of biographies of the early Kagyu founding fathers written by this group of Drukpa Kagyu yogins. And they had a particular kind of agenda, that group of Kagyu yogins. They really wanted to push a certain interpretation of style within Kagyu. I'm not knocking it, but it means that they played up certain elements and discounted others. And also their works, their namtas and their biographies, are actually very good in literary terms, but that makes them a little suspect. There's some harmonization and some kind of almost like they're kind of semi-historical novels rather than being straightforward Tibetan Dharma histories. Straightforward Tibetan Dharma histories tend to be more pedantic and more boring, more full of exact lineages and so on, and not quite so colourful. So just a little word of warning in a way. One has to distinguish between the more or less certain and the less certain. Luckily enough, all Tibetan Dharma histories are about 10 billion times more reliable than any Indian histories of Dharma. So that's good news. Tibetans were good historians. Even for a modern academic, one could say that, I think. So yes, Marpa. What sparked me off on this digression is because it's said that Marpa was sent away by his parents to learn Sanskrit because he was a very difficult child, very, very angry, bright and angry. Maybe it's true, but he was bright, and so they send him off to Drokmi Lotsawa. Drokmi, the translator, the translator from Drok, is Sakya Yeshi, to give him his full name, is an incredibly important figure in his own right. He's like a forefather of the Sakya tradition because he will receive the lambda and transmit it on, and eventually will be absorbed in Sakya. But at that time, he's one of the most prestigious translators in Tibet, and he's already kind of quite wealthy. And he's so if you're looking to get your son apprenticed to a good trade, translator for a bright young potential intellectual, send him off to become a translator, who then will be equipped and go off to India and bring back teachings to translate them. It's a lifestyle choice. And it's what Marpa's parents obviously had in mind for him. So they send him to Drokmi. Drokmi's a great guy. I think very, very devoted to Drokmi. He's holder of the Lambda lineage. But it didn't quite work between him and Marpa. And so Marpa's unsatisfied. He learns Sanskrit to a certain standard from Drokmi, but doesn't get into the Dharma transmissions. Drokmi seems to be very careful about who he gave transmissions to. And so Marpa gets no Dharma, but he's inspired to go to India. So he goes to India. It's probably not even 20 by the time he initially goes to India with some companions. And with this begins an extraordinary life, really. As far as we can tell, because I'm trying to be careful about what is discountable and what we can probably accept as true, he spends some time in Nepal. That seems to have been the pattern for young Tibetans going to India, to acclimatize to what's going to wait them in India by staying in Nepal, because it's a little higher, it's a little safer health-wise for the Tibetans. So he learns some more Sanskrit and starts to learn some Vajrayana Dharma. I mean, he's heard it in Tibet. All families are Buddhist by this time. So he's got Buddhism in his background, he knows something. But he starts to encounter the richness of Vajrayana, really, when he's in Nepal, because they meet some people who are disciples of really great panditas, really great siddhas, actually, in India. So he meets this Chittapa and Pandipata in Nepal and stays there for a year or so. And here's the names of the people to meet in India, the people you really need to meet. And foremost among them is a scholar and yogin, called, well, how to put his name, because there's variations of it, Nadapada, Narotapa, or Naropa. And that last one is the least likely, but it's the one that is known by in Kagyu. Naropa's this one-time scholar, one-time kind of chancellor almost of Nalanda, the great monastic university. So heir to fantastic wealth of philosophical Dharma philosophical teachings, who then becomes, in midlife, becomes a disciple of a really extremely powerful tantric yogin called Tilopa, the one who grinds sesame seeds, obviously not his real name, but who, like Naropa, had one time been a great monk and a great scholar, but sought out the Vajrayana, because that's the pattern of that time. The Vajrayana, the real powerful Vajrayana, the Anuttara, is not being practiced in the monasteries. It's too wild, and it involves lifestyle that is very different from a monastic lifestyle. It's kept on the outside. So if you can maybe practice the lower tantras, but you cannot practice the Anuttara tantra. And you see that again and again during the medieval period in India. To do that, you've got to go out. You've got to go and find the right guru, the right master, and you'll have to then become a yogin giving up your monastic life and wandering probably from place to place, if not staying in remote hermitages. So Tilopa's done that. Naropa repeats the same pattern. And from Tilopa, he receives very important cycles of Vajrayana Dharma, particularly to do with the goddess Vajravarahi, and to do with Chakasamvara Tantra, and to do with different completion stage yogas. So he's already extraordinarily famous in Buddhist circles in India by the time, even Atisha goes and gets teaching from him, for instance, by the time Marpa pitches up there in the 1030s. So Marpa goes and spends time in Pulahari. Even the location of Pulahari is a bit controversial, but it's probably somewhere in Bihar. He stays there with Naropa and receives very, very important teachings. One he doesn't receive, by the way, is a particular form of Vajrayogini that's very closely associated with Naropa, called Narokachoma. That will only go down to the Sakya line. But he receives the other one, the Vajravarahi, which Tilopa had given him. And Marpa gets it from Naropa. So he receives a bunch of tantric initiations and teachings on Mahamudra, and in particular he sees the 6 dharmas, these completion stage yogas from Naropa, which are, of course, the heat yoga, the illusory body, the dream, the bardo, the transference, and the clear light yogas. All variations on the completion stage. But he goes elsewhere as well. He meets other tantric gurus while he's down this first trip. He meets the great yogin Kukkuripa, king of the dogs, as his name indicates, who, according to the more colourful versions of the story, lives on an island surrounded by dogs, who at night turn into goddesses and then turn back to dogs in the day. That's happened, in the world. So I'm not saying it didn't happen there. Anyway, so from Kukkuripa he receives the tantric lineage of Mahamaya, a very important Anuttara Tantra practice. And then he meets also Jñānagarbha, another master. So at the end of this first major visit to India, he's received a lot. And he's practiced. So he's kind of quite experienced, quite learned, good translator. And he goes back to Tibet. There he's able now, he gets some disciples come to him, they're still fairly young. Some disciples gather around him, some relatives, some other people, and some of his relatives didn't even like him. So Marpa has a colourful, interesting social life. And marries his consort, Damema. And there's a story, you see, because one of the most important deities that Naropa will practice, we see from Naropa and practice, is the deity Hevajra, or Gepadoji in Tibetan. And the female aspect of Hevajra is called Damema, or Naraitme, or non-self. So his Yidam is Hevajra and his wife is Damema. It all works out very neatly. And I'm not even mentioning the 8 minor consorts who conform to the 8 goddesses of the mandala. So Marpa is a Tantrika, classic Tibetan Tantrika. Is that the same as the Indian Siddhas with whom he's been studying? No. Notice, the Indian Siddhas are wild, crazy yogins roaming around from place to place. I mean, they're celebrated. There's some stories from elsewhere of Naropa being carried on a palanquin and the townspeople coming out to salute him. So they're not, rejects or anything like that. They're still highly valued, but they're crazy and wild looking and very, very unconventional. Marpa's a Tibetan-style Tantrika. They're more aristocratic. They have property. They have farms and families, which Marpa did. So he settles down to this kind of life in Drowalung in South Tibet with the wife, and the children will come. But he's practicing. He's a very serious practitioner, but he's a practitioner and a family household. You see, the Indian Siddhas gave up their monastic vows, and they may have had consorts, as it were, on the road, those who did, but they don't settle down and marry. Marpa does. And he's a man of means. He's a man of property. And influence and power in the local area. But he knows his studies are not complete, so he goes back to India on the second occasion, And again, even this is a little bit confused in the histories. Sometimes it's represented as the third visit, but other times it's represented as the second visit. So this, he goes back to see Naropa. And it appears that when he went back in 1040, he meets Atisha, by the way, on the way. Atisha is coming into Tibet, and he's going out. And Atisha, of course, knew Naropa. But it appears that Naropa's died. It's not really clear, because in the later accounts, Marpa carries on with his search for Naropa, goes through all kind of visionary experiences, and later meets Naropa, who had in a way sent those visionary experiences to test Marpa, and then finally gives a very decisive transmission to Marpa. Is this visionary or is it actual? It is very difficult to be sure about this. And is this a second journey or third? I think it's the second, but different Tibetan historians have different views about this. Perhaps the most reliable is the view it's in the Blue Annals written by Lotsawa. That's very reliable, I think. So anyway, it's now time to introduce the second major guru for Marpa, because this will have an enormous impact also on Kagyu. Because the inheritance from Naropa is going to be one key strand in determining what is Kagyu teaching, what is the, if you like, signature teachings. And that is the Naro Chudruk, the 6 Dharmas of Naropa, together with the deities like Chakasamvara, Vajravarahi, Hevajra, and so on. But now he meets another great master, somebody who'd actually been a disciple of Naropa as well. That's the master Maitripa, or Maitripa, however you want to pronounce it. Maitripa had been a monk at Vikramashila, I think, where Atisha had at one time been abbot, and he'd been expelled from the monastery because of practicing Anuttara Tantra. Even though Atisha knew he was a good practitioner, it was still breaking the monastic rules. The use of alcohol in the sok puja and so on was a breakage. So Maitripa, nevertheless, he was quite learned in Chittamatra, Madhyamaka tenet system, so he's a very learned practitioner as well as a Tantrika. And key teaching from Maitripa was Mahamudra itself, the Great Seal, the direct teaching of resting in and recognizing the nature of mind which includes all phenomena, which itself is like space, and like space is unelaborated beyond all extremes. This is the essence of the Mahamudra, in which view, therefore, there's no samsara to reject, because everything is just naturally space, and nirvana is not to be found by rejecting samsara. This is Naropa Maitripa's presentation of the inseparability of samsara and nirvana, according to Mahamudra. And as Marpa himself later said, it's only when I heard the Mahamudra from Maitripa that I had decisive realization. So Maitripa becomes of equal significance for Marpa. And he returns to Tibet, and gradually more and more disciples gather around him to receive the array of tantric teachings that he's collected in India. There's one more journey, and this, I think, is his third journey. Again, there's some uncertainty about this, but it's also remarkable because this time he goes, and on the way back, as he's passing through Nepal, he's detained at the customs. Anybody who's been to Nepal knows a little bit about these things. So they used to tax Tibetans going back into Tibet from Nepal. He's detained there and even imprisoned for a few days. And while he's there, presumably raising the bribes, the contributions to the economy, he has a vision of the great Siddha Saraha. Now, Saraha is really, in a way, the first human figure in the Mahamudra transmission lineage. So 3 steps back from Maitripa. Saraha appears to him and gives him a direct blessing and transmission, which again further help Marpa to realize the Mahamudra itself, the essence of the Mahamudra. So these are, in a way, this is what Marpa had received, and these are the masters from whom he received his teachings. He's back in Tibet now, and like I say, gradually more disciples seek him out. His reputation grows, and in time, 4 major disciples come who will inherit his transmissions, and all of them are lay people. None of them are monastics. We're very far away from monasticism in this environment and at this time. So they are Ngok Chukudoji, Meton Sompo, So Wongdo, and Jetsa Mila Shepa Doji. Each of them are important in their own way, and Marpa gives slightly different transmissions of what he's brought from India to them. So they become specialists in different particular tantric teachings. For instance, the Hevajra teaching, which was so important for Marpa, it's one of his main, possibly his main yidam, in fact, he gives to Ngok Chukudoji. And so for Ngok Chukudoji's children and so on, a lineage will spread. It will be absorbed into the big Kagyu lineage later, but it's through Ngok Chukudoji. Meton Sompo also was a Hevajra practitioner. So Wongdo, Sutam Wongdo, to him his full name, was a practitioner of Gui Samaja Tantra, and so on. Marpa's wife is also a practitioner. She's a very accomplished yogini. But it's the 4th disciple upon whom most attention is given, because that's Mila Shepa Doji, Jetsa Milarepa, who will become the main lineage holder in the subsequent view of these things. I mean, they're all the 4 major disciples are lineage holders. They've all got his teachings, and he's authorized them to pass them on once they've practiced them. But Mila will become in a way the most significant because of the wide range of his influence. Really, that is how then Marpa spent the rest of the time in that area. As in one history it says, he didn't really make a big show of himself in the area. Many people just considered him a wealthy farmer, and even some of his relatives just had quarrels with him over property. So it's a kind of hidden style, and it was very much that pattern at that time, because there are no monasteries. And so you attract disciples come to you if they want, but there's none of the kind of major trappings of an institution. It's quite a kind of hidden yogin type of lifestyle. Even though he's powerful and influential, he can still in a way be a secular figure, Marpa. That's what makes it quite important, I think, for us to understand that he's not like a monastic or not like a wild, crazy dropout yogin. He's something else entirely. The scholar translator, who's also a farmer, a family man, and a local influential figure. Yes, he also happens to be an extraordinarily realized tantric yogin. For instance, the story is that when Marpa passed away, he and his wife simultaneously passed away, and they passed away into the clear light, dissolving exactly as Hevajra and Naratmya do in the sadhana. Perhaps it's a later embellishment, but at least it points to a spiritual truth that however he appeared to ordinary people, he was an extraordinary yogin. Something, of course, known to his great disciples. And as I said, of the 4 great disciples, Mila is the one who will be most significant for later history. In fact, at one time, Marpa had a dream of 4 pillars, and each of those pillars stood a different animal, and those 4 pillars are represented his 4 major disciples: Meton, Ngok, Sur, and Mila. So he's the father of the Kagyu. Then 2 very different figures will follow in the line. First of all, the very ascetic and determined yogin Mila Shepadoji, or Jetsa Milarepa, to give him a more honorific title, who will be followed in turn by the monk and scholar Gampopa. Very different characters, each of them, but out of the flow of the teachings from one to the other, and the influence of their personalities and their style on the teachings, will come, in a way, the fully fledged Kagyu. By the end of Gampopa's life, what we can really call the Kagyu tradition is in existence, with its own specific monasteries forming, its own specific style of practice and study, even its own specific textbooks are beginning to be composed. So the Kagyu comes in that way. The name Kagyu, well, again, even in Tibet, there are different opinions about that name. For instance, some people in the Drokpa Kagyu lineage think it should be Drokpa Kagyu, Kagyu meaning white lineage. And why that? Well, because Miller, not Marpa, Miller, as an ascetic yogin, wore only a white cotton cloth. And hence his name, Miller Repa, the cotton clad one. Marpa, by contrast, wore just nice-looking Tibetan aristocratic clothing. So some say Kagyu comes from that, but more likely it comes from the four major lineages that Naropa received from Tilopa and passed on to Marpa himself, the Kababjiju, the four lineages of injunction, in which the different completion stage yogas and Mahamudra is transmitted. So Marpa was the holder from Naropa. Marpa becomes considered the holder of Kababjiju, the lineage of Kababji, the four commands or four injunctions. That's then contracted in typical Tibetan style to Kagyu. So Marpa's transmission will be called the Kagyu transmission or Marpa Kagyu transmission. And then whoever follows it is called a Kagyupa, one of the Kagyu. And then there becomes, by the end of Gampopa's life, a recognizably Kagyu identity with monasteries, texts, and so on and so forth. Because I'm trying to indicate that everything forms naturally and organically according to dependent origination. Marpa didn't design the Kagyu. It's clear he didn't really have such a concept. He was just a tantric, disciple of his own tantric masters in India, just sharing what he'd been told to share by Naropa and Maitripa with this bunch of Tibetans who came to him. Obviously, he wanted the teachings to continue and flourish and benefit beings, spread, but he didn't design a lineage. The idea that Milarepa could design a lineage is even more laughable, because Milarepa was an ascetic who wanted to stay in his cave and just accepted disciples who were brave enough to go out there and meet him. He has no idea. Of course, Milarepa makes a prophecy. One day, the name of the Kagyu will be spread throughout the world. But he was not a CEO. He didn't have a financial officer. There was no plan. There was no mission statement. Even Gampopa didn't have that. And he was the most organized of all of them. So I wanted to concentrate on Marpa for today because it's where it begins. And Marpa is so human. I mean, even though I made point of saying how the histories, particularly later ones, are not so reliable, a really human figure still does emerge. As I say, we can trust the bare accounts of his life and the good, sober sources like Lotsawa and so on. And from them, even without the more colorful accounts, there's a very recognizable human person embodied in a particular family, embodied in a particular society, in a particular place, in particular time. And yet at the same time, there's this extraordinary person. He's ordinary to his neighbors and some of his relatives, and to others he's extraordinary. What a wonderful metaphor, is that word, for how we should be as Dharma people. Even if we practice and study extraordinary things and become changed inside, which we hope we will be, to the world we should be gentle and easy and approachable and not set against the world. And Marpa shows that.